today to allow me to have an opportunity to speak about what I'm passionate about, which is the human mind and its potential. So science has taught us that this incredibly complex organ, our brain, that we carry with us everywhere we go, really has a critical role in shaping who we are. And it is an incredibly complex organ. There's something on the order of 86 billion neurons in our brain. And if we think about the world's population, that's a mere 7 billion. So it puts the complexity in perspective. And we also know that there are hundreds of trillions of connections within our brain. And again, to compare, if we think about the Milky Way galaxy, there are actually more connections in our brain than the stars in the Milky Way galaxy. So our brain filters our perceptions and our understanding of ourselves, of others, of our world, and our relationship to that world. And to me, what's also fascinating is that no two brains are exactly identical. If you think about a loved one, you look at the person next to you, and you note the differences between you, shape of your nose, eye color, your height. There are actually more differences between your two brains than those physical differences combined. So simply put, your brain makes you uniquely you. And it does shape who we are. And to me, what's most promising is that we know through the application of the principles of neuroplasticity, simply put, the brain's ability to change, to strengthen neural connections, to grow new neural connections, to grow new neurons as a result of experience, as a result of stimulation, that we can change the brain physiologically and functionally, which impacts our ability to learn, and that this can happen across our lifespan. I've worked with individuals as young as 5 and as old as 81 and seen the same degree of change across that age. So my story begins with my brain and is a story of personal discovery, and it's also a universal story. The personal was a hunt for a solution to very, very severe and crippling learning disorders. And the universal is that we all have a brain, and that we all have our own unique cognitive profile of strengths and weaknesses that shapes who we are and how we can function. And if one imagines having a brain that's both capable and incapable at the same time, that was my experience, and is the experience of most individuals struggling with learning challenges. So growing up, I lived in a world that was very, very confusing and incomprehensible. And I was later to discover that there were really critical parts of my brain that weren't performing or working properly. And the end result of one of these areas was that language was really incomprehensible to me. It was almost like language, when I listened to something, it was almost like a foreign language, and my interpreter really wasn't working. So most of what I heard was about as intelligible as Lewis Carroll's The Jabberwocky, which is not really very intelligible. I could understand concrete things. So if somebody said to me, it's raining outside, or the man is wearing a black coat, I could conjure up an image or a picture in my mind's eye, and I could understand that because it was concrete. But as soon as it got into relationships or abstract concepts, I struggled. So things like fractions. I mean, I could understand what the number 1 was because I could see one object, or I could understand what 4 was because I could count 4 objects. But as soon as you put that 1 over top of the 4, it was a relationship, a part to a whole, and that meant nothing to me. I just didn't understand what that relationship was. And other things, relationships like bigger and smaller, greater than, less than, were really, really difficult for me. I would fill my notebooks with drawings and diagrams, trying to illustrate or create a roadmap to understand what the language was telling me. Other things that I struggled with, I couldn't understand how somebody could have 2 relationships. So how could my mother's sister also be my aunt? That just didn't make sense to me. And so finding connections between things, to see how things interconnect and relate, was really almost insurmountable. And something as simple as reading a clock was hard for me, because how do you read a clock? You see the relationship between the hour hand and the minute hand. I couldn't tell time. And in fact, I couldn't tell time until age 26. So I couldn't understand cause and effect. And I really felt that I was buffeted by random events. I used to almost imagine that there was a puppet master somewhere pulling the strings, and that I had really no control over the events in my life, because I couldn't see the logic behind things. I couldn't see the why of events. Things like irony and jokes was really difficult. So what I did is I learned to laugh when other people did, and I would gauge how funny that joke must be by how hard people were laughing, because I didn't grasp the joke. And I couldn't grasp logical inconsistencies in what people said. So it made me really vulnerable to con artists, because how do you tell that you're being conned? You see that some of the things don't quite connect in what the person is saying. And if somebody asked me to consider an alternate way of doing something, I couldn't do that, compare, contrast, weighing pros and cons. And so I became labeled as being rigid, because I would hold on to dear life, to that little that I did understand. And I truly was rigid and stubborn, but it wasn't coming from an emotional place. It was coming from a cognitive incapacity where I couldn't make those connections to let go. And for me, making decisions was paralyzing. My world really consisted of unrelated fragments, like a series of puzzle pieces that really never fit together. And eventually what happened was that fragmented view of my world led to a very fragmented view and sense of myself. And if that wasn't enough, I had some other areas that didn't work very well. I was accident prone, what people would kindly label a klutz. The left side of my body was really an alien being, not connected to the rest of me. I would bang into things on that left side. I was constantly bruised. And if I lifted something like this glass with my left hand, I would end up either dropping it, spilling it on myself, or I might spill it on somebody in the audience, because I couldn't regulate the sensory feedback from my muscles. If I put my left hand on a burner and wasn't looking, I could register pain, but I had no idea where that pain was coming from. I couldn't register the location of the sensation. So I truly was a danger to myself, and my mother was convinced that by the age of 5 I would be dead because I was so accident prone. And if that wasn't enough, there was another area that wasn't working. I couldn't represent three-dimensional space in my head. There were no maps in my head. I would get lost in my friend's house. Crossing the street, something as simple as crossing the street, held terror for me, because when you cross the street, one of the ways that you do that is create a mental map of where you are relative to that car that's coming at you. I couldn't do that. So as children with learning problems do, I developed a strategy to compensate. I would block blocks out of my way to find a stop sign or a street light where I knew it would be safe to stop, because I knew the cars had, or cross because the cars had to stop. Or the other strategy, I would wait by the side of the road until somebody else came along to cross, and I would hope that they knew what they were doing better than I did, and I would blindly follow them across the street. And I used to joke that I would be as safe crossing the street with my eyes closed as with my eyes open, and there was truth to that. Things like geometry, geography were really difficult because they involve spatial relations. And obviously, I was always the last person selected on a sports team, because really having me on your team, it was not an asset. I was not an asset, because my reaction if a ball was coming at me was to run as quickly as I could in the opposite direction. So yes, they really didn't want me on their team, and I understood why. So when I began my schooling in the 1950s, the brain was viewed as unchangeable, what I call the pre-neuroplastic paradigm. Basically, the view was the brain you're born with is the brain that you're going to die with. And if there's a problem, you need to learn to live with it. So I was told in grade 1 that I had a mental block, that I would never learn like other children. And really, it was a life sentence at that point that I just needed to make my peace with the fact that learning would always be a struggle. And I got through. I had phenomenal memory. I had almost a verbatim auditory memory and photographic memory, and I had incredible drive and determination. And I set on a quest to try to find a solution to my difficulty, because I didn't want to live with that life sentence. And so I was driven to try to come up with a solution. And the answer came in the work of Alexander Luria, the gentleman with the glasses in this picture. He was a brilliant Russian neuropsychologist who did a lot of work after World War II, trying to understand what various regions of the brain, what their job or function was. And he worked a lot with soldiers after World War II in Russia who had very localized head wounds. And what he would do was, clinically work with those individuals to find out what could they no longer do, and then by inference, by inference, what must be the role, the job, or the function of that part of the brain. And it was through reading his book, The Man with the Shattered World. For me, it was in August of 1977 that I came across this book. And it told the story of a Russian soldier, Zizetsky, the other gentleman in this picture, who in 1943 at the Battle of Smolensk had a very localized head wound. And what was fascinating to me as I read what Zizetsky was writing about in his journal in the 1940s and the 1950s, he was using the same image to describe his problem as I was in the 1960s to describe my difficulty. What he said was, I'm in a kind of a fog all the time where meaning is ephemeral, it just disappears in the mist. And in my journal, I was saying, I'm living in a fog where nothing is clear. Zizetsky, after this wound, couldn't tell time, which he could do before. He couldn't understand fractions. He couldn't grasp concepts in mathematics. He didn't understand less than or greater than. All the things that I had struggled with from birth, he couldn't do after having that specific wound. So it led me to realize that the source of my problem was a part of my brain that wasn't functioning, which I hadn't known up until that point. And to solve a problem, the first step is you have to identify the source of the problem. And for me, and for Zizetsky, one of the difficulties was an area in the left hemisphere, the angular gyrus. And it's the part of the brain that does multiple things, but it receives and processes input necessary for our understanding, our comprehension of the world. And to get a feel for this area, if you think about the palm of your hand as a concept or an idea or a construct, and if you think of your fingers as the elements or the pieces of information or the facts that have to go together into a synthesis, into a meaningful whole to then build that construct, that idea, that concept, that's one of the functions of this area. And if there's a problem here, what happens is all of these elements remain unrelated, separate, and disconnected. So you struggle with conceptual meaning or conceptual understanding. And that was my experience, and that was the experience of Zizetsky, that we just lived in very confusing, disconnected, unrelated realities. And Lurie, in his writings, noted that someone with this problem could never verify meaning, and he described how someone with this difficulty lives in a world of constant uncertainty, and that was my experience. So the other piece of the puzzle, now I knew what the problem was, but what do I do about it? So that came in the work of Mark Rosenzweig, a psychologist at Berkeley, who in the 1960s in his lab was demonstrating that stimulating experience for rats was leading to better performance on maze tests and changes in the brain. And what he did was he put rats in different environments. So he put a group of rats in what he called a stimulating or an enriched environment with lots of toys and other rats to play with. One group with a bit to do but not a lot, and then that poor little rat all by itself with really no stimulation, and he called that an impoverished environment. And after having them in these different environments, he gave them maze tests, which is like an intelligence test for rats. And he found that that enriched group performed much more efficiently and effectively in learning the maze. And then what he did is he looked at their brains. And what he found was the brains had changed at a physiological level, which then led to that better performance. They had more glia cells, more neurotransmitters, increased dendrite branching, and if you think that makes more synaptic connections. So the brains had changed physiologically to support the function of learning. And I thought, if I could take Lurie's work and understand what those parts of the brain did, maybe I could find an activity to work and stimulate that part of my brain that wasn't functioning very well. So I set out to see, and I had no idea whether it would work or not, and I thought, what am I going to do but lose time? And I couldn't tell time, so I thought it was fair to try. And so I created my first exercise, and I had to believe, hopefully, that humans had at least as much neuroplasticity as rats, and probably we had more, even though people weren't really investigating it at that time. So I thought, maybe I can find an exercise to work that part of my brain. So what did I pick? Well, I picked clocks. Not so much that I wanted to get better at telling time, which eventually I did, but I wanted to force that part of my brain to process relationships. And what is a clock but a relationship of, those two elements to come together for an interpretation of what the clock is telling us. So was pretty abysmal at the beginning and had to have a friend help me because I was 26 and I couldn't tell time. But eventually I got faster and faster at being able to do it. And then I made it more complex. I added a third hand and a fourth hand. And what I found was about 4 months into that cognitive exercise, I started to experience change in the way I could process and understand information. And what I found was I could actually now listen to conversations as they were unfolding and understand them. Before I lived in what I called lag time. I was always hours behind everybody else. I would memorize conversations and I would go away like a tape recorder and I would play them over and over and over again and come up with hopefully an understanding of what had been said, and sometimes I didn't. But even if I did come to an understanding, it was hours after the conversation had ended, so there was no opportunity to participate in that discussion. Now I was living in what I called real time. I was actually listening to discussions, understanding them, and able to participate in real time as they unfolded. And I'd always wanted to read philosophy and never been able to because it's very conceptually dense. And I had access to a philosophy book. And so I pulled one off the shelf and I opened it to a page at random and read it, and I understood it as I was reading. And again, that had never happened for me. Before, I might read a page 5 times, 10 times, up to 20 times, constantly making a hypothesis as to what the author intended, but never being able to verify meaning, never being certain. And now I could read it, and it made sense, and I understood it. But then I thought maybe I had selected a really easy book. Maybe it was just a fluke. Because I didn't trust myself. So I pulled another book off the shelf, opened it, read it, and I understood it. And by the time I was finished, I had 100 books piled up around me, and I had been able to read and understand each page that I had read. And so I knew something fundamental had changed, because with the best will in the world, I had never been able to do that before. And I'd never been able to understand mathematics. So I went back and I taught myself elementary, high school, and college level mathematics. And I could actually understand it conceptually. I could understand the logic in the math, which I had never been able to do, and could actually see the beauty in mathematics, whereas before there'd only been torture in mathematics. And what really surprised me, which I hadn't expected, is that fragmented sense of myself began to heal. I started to, as I went to bed every night, play scenes from my life up until that point and start to understand that's why that happened. That's why this person did that. And the only way I can describe it, it felt like my psyche was integrated into a whole that had never been there before. And as an aside, since then, I've worked with a number of psychiatrists who have sent me clients that have this specific cognitive deficit. And what they see is as the students move through the cognitive exercise and get to a certain point, they can benefit from insight therapy. Because if you can't make connections, if you can't see relationships, you can't gain insight into the events in your life. So it's a key critical area for being able to navigate and function in the world. So after experiencing this change, I thought, can I now go out and create some exercises for those other areas, that one where I was a danger to myself? And that's the somatosensory cortex in the right hemisphere for me, because it controlled the left side of my brain, so the part of the brain that registers sensation. And this area, as you can see from the diagram, maps sensation onto different parts of the body. And for me, the whole left side of my body was really alien territory or uncharted territory. I didn't know where sensation was coming from, and it really left me vulnerable to accidents. So I was cut, bruised, banged on that left side of my body, and often didn't know where those bruises, bangs, and cuts came from. And I was so bad, once I was trying to close a door with my right hand, and the door wasn't closing, and I was feeling pain, and I didn't know where the pain was coming from. So I looked down, and there was this left hand stuck in the drawer that the right hand was closing. I actually slammed a car door on my head and fractured a tooth with my left hand. It really was an alien part of me doing things that really weren't always necessarily in my best interest. And by extension, when I learned how to drive, if I didn't know where the left side of my body was, I didn't know where that left side of my car was. So my car was almost a mere representation of my body. The left side had dents and dings and bangs, just like my body. So I knew to work on this part, I needed to do something with my eyes closed, because how did I compensate for that area? I would watch what that left side of my body was doing. So I learned how to draw very complex figures with my eyes shut as accurately as with my eyes open. And the part of the brain that processes and registers sensation got a real workout with that exercise. And now I am functional on the left side of my body. I can do things with this left hand. I don't bang into door frames. Luckily, my car spends very little time in the auto body shop because I'm not denting and dinging and banging it. And I'm really no longer a danger to myself. And then there was the part of the brain that is a key component in spatial navigation. And I created an exercise to address that area, and now I no longer get lost. Before, when I had this difficulty, I used to calculate in what I called lost time. So every time I went anywhere, I knew I'd get lost anywhere from 5 to 10 times before I finally reached my destination. And now I don't have to calculate in lost time. I can read maps. I can understand maps. And those words, especially with the IKEA it's in the world now, some assembly required, no longer strike terror into my heart, because I can go from a two-dimensional representation and construct something in 3 dimensions. So I realized there was value in putting these lines of research together, using Luria's detailed descriptions of the cognitive functions and Luria's work on differential stimulation leading to differential change. So I went on to work with people and eventually came to identify 19 different cognitive functions. And I'm very clear that that's not everything that can impact learning. It's just where my work is now, and it's a subset of the incredible range of cognitive functions that we have. But what I came to understand is that every individual has his or her own unique cognitive profile made up of cognitive strengths and weaknesses, and that difficulties combine in different ways to impact social learning, academic learning, learning in vocation, and that the key to addressing these for the individuals I work with who are having learning problems is really to identify their specific cognitive profile and then target the specific difficulties they have. And we know that the brain works in what Luria called a functional system, what we now call a neural network. So there's no one part of your brain that reads or that writes. It's multiple areas that come together to perform intellectual tasks. And a problem in any area or in a network within an area is going to lead to very specific difficulties in functioning. And this is a blood flow study looking at the brain reading out loud. And what we see is there's no one area involved in reading. There are multiple areas that come together to support that process. And there isn't time to really describe these areas in this presentation. They're described in detail on the Arrowsmith School website or in my book. But what I want to point out is that the incredible complexity of the learning process. And any teacher that works with individuals with reading problems will know that they can have 5 different children struggling with reading, and each one might have a different profile. And to address one of these difficulties, we have to first identify what are the cognitive components for that individual and then target those specifically so that we're addressing what that child uniquely needs. So if we want to just try a little cognitive function task to see how it might impact us in life, we've all seen a cat before in our life. So a simple way to see how this part of your brain is working is think of a cat, close your eyes for just a couple of seconds, and can you call up an image of a cat in your mind's eye? So just see if you can do that, see that cat. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes and let's see how well you did. Some people will have seen that cat in incredible detail, like the fur, the shade, the shape of the ears, the color of the eyes. And what is the case is that a cognitive function operates on a continuum from exceptional ability to significant weakness, and we're all somewhere on that continuum. Some people, when they close their eyes, will have just experienced the back of their eyelids. They won't have seen anything. And that just gives an idea of what that continuum is like. And obviously the individuals I work with are coming through the door with significant weaknesses in these different cognitive functions. So somebody that has this difficulty, some of the things, if they're strong, they'll be really good at being able to navigate by remembering the look of a place. If they're weak, this is the individual, that the visual world is sort of flat and gray and uninteresting. I had an illustrator that had this problem, and she would leave the whiskers off the cat when she was drawing it, or she'd forget the buttons on the coat. She would miss the visual details. People, if they have a difficulty here, don't like to meditate because they can't call up the visual imagery. They can't call up their happy place. And people that have this difficulty may get lost, not because they can't read maps, but they don't remember the landmarks to navigate. This is the area that Oliver Sacks talked about in his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. I had an individual that had traumatic head injury here in this area. And on the first day that he came to the school, when he was leaving, he tried to walk out a filing cabinet because it was rectangular and it had a handle, so it, to him, looked like a door. And what might be considered not a critical problem can have significant impact. I had a student who was in pathology with this difficulty, and he was examining breast tissue, and it was somebody that had had cancer, and she'd gone through chemotherapy and radiation, and he was just about to sign off that she was in remission when his supervisor came over and pointed to cells in the top corner of the slide and said, "Did you not see these? This is cancer." And it wasn't that he wasn't careful or diligent, he truly didn't hold the look of those cells to match it up to what he was seeing on the slide. So some of what we think of as human error could be that cognitive function isn't matching the demand of the task. And then also this area can impact facial recognition. So the person that will recognize your face in context, say if you're on the front porch of your house, but 10 minutes later if you're walking down the street, they don't recognize you because you're out of context. They can't hold the image of your face to match it up to the person. And I've certainly worked with individuals with that difficulty. And then if you want to try another activity, this is another part of the brain, instead of calling up the image of the cat, this time when you close your eyes, can you see the word cat, almost like a blackboard, on a blackboard in your mind's eye? So if you just want to take a second, see whether you can see that image. And some people will see it really crisp and clear. Other people, it might be fuzzy or blurred. The children that I work with that struggle with reading often just see a blank screen. They don't hold the visual image. And this is a cognitive area responsible for that visual symbol template learning. And various researchers call this the brain's letterbox, visual word form area. I call it symbol recognition. And just to give you an idea, if you're strong here, this is the person that has visual photographic memory. And they can remember things like not only word patterns, spelling patterns, but math formula, chemical equations. They hold the visual image. Or if they're poor, this is the child, obviously, that struggles with reading, learning how to spell. And what do we do for this area? Just to give you a little snapshot of one of the cognitive exercises, I have a number of languages programmed into the computer with a very specific process that students go through, and this is Amharic from Ethiopia that this student is looking at. And why do I use foreign languages? Because I don't want other areas to support the problem area. I don't want to divert sort of energy or focus into other areas. It's very targeted. So the student can't put sound to this, they can't put meaning to this. They have to hold the look of these symbol patterns in their mind's eye to move through. And for people that are interested in research, we have, I think, 10 or 11 outcome studies on the Arrowsmith School website that look at the results of a number of the cognitive exercises. What we see shift with this is spelling, word recognition, visual matching, all of, again, the facility with visual pattern recognition. And so what are some of the other areas that I work on? There's a whole range. So auditory memory, the person that can't hold information, the person that you might know that puts Post-it notes up all around their office or their home, to remind them of the things that they do, the person that's going to be lost without the to-do list, the child that goes home at the end of the day and forgets what they're supposed to do for homework. Often these individuals get labeled as being irresponsible, not that they're irresponsible, but they're asked to do a series of things. They walk away and they may do one or two and then totally forget that there was something else that they were expected to do. So they don't complete the tasks. And then I have a problem for, what some researchers call quantity blindness, the person who, to them, 10, 100, 1,000 all mean the same thing. These are the people that run out of gas on the highway, that can't budget. They run out of money, they can't schedule time because they don't have a sense of units of quantity. And then the individual that struggles with the writing process, that can't learn motor plans, so they can't put their thoughts down efficiently and effectively on paper. And then individuals that struggle with nonverbal thinking or interpretation of situations, so struggle with social skills. And one researcher labeled this area cognitive Goldilocks, which I love, because it's the area that allows us to project ourselves into situations before actually being in that situation and run scenarios to imagine how we might act in that situation and what some of the various outcomes are. So if somebody has difficulty here, they struggle socially. And I like to make up words, so I talk about premature closure. So a child that has, or an individual that has this difficulty, doesn't actively survey all of the information in the situation before making an interpretation. So when they go to act, they're acting on a small set of all of the data or the information, so their actions often get them into difficulty. And then I work with a lot of adults, and there's really no part of the brain that is unimportant. Each part contributes to some aspect of our functioning over the course of the day. And I see adults who have what I call a cognitive mismatch, where the job that they're involved in is placing demands on cognitive functions that they aren't really strong with, like that pathologist that I talked about. But I had a butcher once who came through the door with his left hand in bandages. He had that kinesthetic problem that I had. So imagine you have a sharp knife in this hand and you don't know where this hand is. It wasn't really a good career choice for him. But we worked on that area and he stopped cutting himself. But then I saw somebody with a milder level of difficulty there, and she was on the equestrian team. And how do you control the horse? It's with the pressure on the flanks. And she would either overpress or underpress because she couldn't regulate the amount of pressure she was using, and she would lose competitions. And then I had a pilot who had that auditory memory difficulty. And imagine you're flying into airspace, and his strategy was to get the air traffic controller to repeat the instructions over and over and over again. I always worried, what if that air traffic controller was really busy and could only say those instructions once? And so, I mean, the solution was address that problem, which we did, and eventually he could hear the information once and retain it and know what to do. But again, those things that we often think are human error could be, at times, this cognitive mismatch. So just really quickly, I want to bring us back to that concept of neuroplasticity. And we often think only of the positive outcomes of improved cognitive functioning as a result of stimulation. But neuroplasticity, in a sense, is a neutral concept. It just means the brain is capable of change. And there was a study done in 2012 looking at the impact of mental health issues on neuroplasticity, which the quote is at the bottom. But what they found was there were negative brain changes as a result of prolonged exposure to chronic stress, to anxiety, to depression. And so what I think we need to all be aware of in our practices is we want to do everything we can to increase those positive factors, a lot of which we will probably hear over the course of this conference, and we want to do everything we can to reduce the impact of those negative factors, to reduce those stressors that have negative effect on the brain. And then, which makes sense, there's a lot of research now looking at variability in neuroplasticity. If we think about the human condition, there are individual differences in variability in almost everything, so why wouldn't there be in the brain's ability to change? And so there's research now looking at genetic factors, dopamine, and I'm sure there'll be other factors that we will discover. And certainly in my work, over the years, I've seen individuals that come in with very similar profiles, same gender, same age, do the same amount of work. They both make progress, but one moves 4 times more quickly than the other, which probably points to this variability in plasticity. And then if we think about what are the conditions that research is telling us for neuroplastic change, we know active sustained attention, engagement, effort for processing, and novelty and task complexity. And if we take these factors and put them into anything that we're doing, we'll make it more of a challenge or stimulating experience for the brain. So the first one, active sustained engagement, just really means that you need to actively set your mind to the task. I mean, what our mind is attending to is what our brain is engaged with. And we need to do it for a sustained period of time. There's no real quick fix for changing the brain. I mean, if you thought that you could work out for the Olympics by every day walking to the mailbox and back, you wouldn't really achieve your goal. It's the same with the brain. It needs that active, sustained attention. And then effort for processing. What we've learned is you need to calibrate the level of the difficulty of the task. If it's too hard, it's almost like, your brain is not engaged because it's spinning gears. And if it's too easy, the same thing. So you need to ensure that the level of the difficulty of the task that you're setting yourself is just slightly beyond attainability. And that means that you can eventually master it, and then once you've mastered it, you make it a little more difficult to continue to keep the brain engaged and working. And the other thing is the novelty task complexity. The novelty and task complexity just means that as soon as your brain goes on autopilot, and there are lots of things that it's useful to be on autopilot, but once it's on autopilot, it's not really engaged in processing, to move forward. So just like I did with the clocks, I had the 2 hands, but then I added more complexity, 3 hands, 4 hands, to continue the level of difficulty, to continue, my brain, having to really work to achieve mastery and to process that information. So these are some key factors that people can add into, if they want to take up a language or learn chess or dancing, just to kind of keep these in mind. So how can we reduce some of those negative factors, in terms of causing negative neuroplastic changes? I mean, one of the things that research has looked at is meditation. And we know that something as simple as meditation, or it can be as complex as meditation, leads to positive changes in the brain related to learning, to memory, to self-regulation, introspection, and reduces anxiety, has a positive impact on stress and depression, all those things that lead to negative changes. So, having some quiet time, contemplative time in your day is only healthy for the brain. And the other thing, we're a society that's quite sleep deprived, and research is showing a lot about the importance of sleep. And we know that, when we haven't had a good night's sleep, we don't learn. But what research is showing is that sleep helps us consolidate what we've been learning during the day. So it's maybe, turn off that alarm clock or make sure you go to bed earlier, because sleep is really important and essential in terms of learning and reducing some of those negative effects. So the other thing that I think is really encouraging is there's plasticity over the lifespan. So it reminds us that as much as possible, it's important over our lifespan to really be consciously aware of the things that lead to positive brain health and trying to enhance those, and the things that lead to negative brain health and trying to find ways to reduce those, because we have this organ with us over our lifespan and it is capable of positive change. And the other thing is, obviously, we want to try to, as much as possible, ensure that the positive changes we get are sustained over time. So let's go quickly through. So we want to work towards positive change, obviously, and sustained brain change is not achieved quickly. We know anytime we do anything with our brain, anything we learn is causing changes. But those sustained changes that really lead to changes in long-term functioning need significant change in a neural workout. Like, it's not just as simple, again, as I said, walking to the mailbox each day. And certainly the cognitive exercises that I've developed have these factors built in to really work towards sustained change. And I've tracked people now over 30 years out of the program, and what we see is there's no drop-off in function. The change has been maintained over certainly that period of time. And then what do we want to do, again, to ensure that change? We want to make sure that these changes aren't just a practice effect or short-term wiring changes, which are of benefit, but what can we do to work towards this? So again, keeping our brain actively and positively engaged across our lifetime is really important. And as we get those cognitive changes, as we become aware of them, is integrate them into our daily practice and into our lives, so that they just become a natural part of our activity. And as I've mentioned, is reduce those negative factors, increase the positive factors. And we've all heard of Hebb's principle. I mean, neurons that fire together wire together, and the more that we can do this, the more chance there is of sustaining those changes. And why is this beneficial? It's because it contributes to optimal performance and cognitive functioning, which is only a good thing. And then, what is my vision? Some people ask, like, what is my vision for education? And I mean, we know that we all have a brain, that it shapes us. We know that we have the capacity to shape and change it. And I think what I would love to see is every child starting in grade 1, part of their curriculum is cognitive programs. The school becomes a place that you go not only to learn things, but to work out your brain so that your brain can learn more efficiently and effectively. And what I hear from the individuals that I work with across the lifespan is at some point they stopped dreaming. They say they don't dare to dream. And what I think this kind of work and other work that's being developed has the potential not only to allow these individuals to dream, but actually to open the door and the possibility so that they can actually live and realize their dreams. So I thank you.